every every time. This was just for scheduling conflict. But this is our second time we're doing the Qualitative Tuesdays. Today we'll be talking about data transcription and translation. And similar to last week, I last month I picked two different articles to kind of help us guide that discussion a little bit. And then also, like last time, I'll hand it over to Felipe and the Lipes group to see if they have any additional things that they would like to add and share some of their own experiences when it comes to transcription and translation in qualitative research. As you know, this recording will be live streamed on YouTube. And then I would say once we get to the questions and some more of the discussions and maybe some things, some additional questions you might have after after the presentation, we'll stop the recording so everybody feels free to speak. All right. Now, before we get started on the two papers that we'll be going through today, I just wanted to kind of give a quick refresher on some of the reporting guidelines, specifically for qualitative research. So the one of them is the Consolidated Criteria for Reporting Qualitative Research, or CORA guidelines. Um, which I think most people are aware of, and a lot of journals are requiring that particular checklist to be included in qualitative manuscript submissions. And then the other one is the Standards for Reporting Qualitative Research, or SRQR. So on the core guideline, I just kind of screenshotted the part that we're talking about more a little bit today, that is on data collection. And here you'll see that it doesn't talk about um, anything about the process of transcribing or translating, right? So we have the duration of the interviews, and then we have where the transcripts returned. But we don't have that extra step of details about how a transcript was um, generated. Now, when we look at the standards for reporting qualitative research, you'll see they go through very similar topics. They do have data processing, and that includes the methods for processing data prior to and during analysis, including transcription. Right, so you'll see that here in one of them, they do talk a little bit about wanting you to give input on the process of transcribing the data and kind of preparing the data. All right, so let's get into the first paper. This is a research paper in Voluntas, which is one of the main journals for nonprofit organizations and community-based organizations. And this one talks about transcription and qualitative methods. So, as we all know, qualitative research is understanding and interpreting the socially constructed world around us. Um, and we're having resources and literature on the collection and analysis of qualitative data, as we've seen in the reporting guidelines, but also we have, a lot of textbooks on it, a lot of literature on it, on how to best collect and how to best analyze qualitative data. But we don't have all that much attention towards the transcription, so audio to text conversion. And with that, transcription is really often presented as a direct conversion of recorded audio to text. But then we're kind of taking that as it's an aspect that we can take for granted of the research process. But then it begs the question of the reflexivity that is so important in qualitative research. Um, and then similar to what we discussed last month during the rapid qualitative analysis, we have a shifting landscape, right? We have more technology available to us, like voice to text softwares and or artificial intelligence. And the landscape also is shifting that we do a lot more remote data collection through video conferencing, for example. So we have a whole lot of new opportunities, but also potentially challenges that come with it. So when we look at qualitative research and transcription specifically, qualitative data can include documents, it can include observations, and then recording of interviews. And that transcription, as I was saying, is that conversion of audio to text. And then that allows us to have transcripts of the interactions. And by that, we avoid relying on, having to recall what somebody told us or only relying on notes that we took. But it also is a really time-consuming process. And with that in mind, though, transcription is more than just the mechanical process of producing an objective record of the audio data. In fact, the authors of this paper actually state that it's not objective, right? As most things in qualitative research, um, you bring in your own personal experiences and your interpretations, and you do need to make decisions um, based on certain factors. So there are subjective decisions to be made, right? For example, what to include and what not to include. Would you correct mistakes? Would you edit grammar? Would you take out repetitions of certain words? Um, and also understanding that there is a difference in the syntax, right? So people speak differently than they would write. So how are you going to take that into consideration? So there, when we think about the transcription, there's kind of a spectrum of transcription approaches. On the one hand, we have the naturalized or intelligent verbatim, where you are adapting the spoken word more to written norms, right? So that could include you're correcting mistakes, you making grammatical edits, and you remove repetitions. Now, some argue that this is a more accurate representation because people who use that argue that it actually is closer to what a participant intended to portray, or closer to how the interviewee might have portrayed themselves in a written format. Again, saying, thinking about that spoken language is different than written language. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have the denaturalized or full verbatim approach, where you include everything word to word. You maintain as somebody utters, you keep the mistakes, you keep the repetitions, you keep the grammatical errors. And some argue that that is then more accurate, right? Because you have that word to word documentation. Um, in that denaturalized approach, you also would include all the nonverbal cues, kind of laughter, tone of voice, those kind of things. And then, as I was saying, this really is a spectrum, right? So you can choose to lay anywhere on that spectrum and make the decisions based on your research needs. So in order for you to make those decisions, the authors give a few considerations. The first one is, do you want to include nonverbal cues? For example, laughter or tone of voice. How and when you use punctuation can really alter the meaning of the individual statement, right? How much contextual information do you want to provide? Do you want to include interruptions, crosstalk, inaudible segments? Um, like I was saying, there really is no single set of rules for transcription. So those decisions, it's always frustrating when you say it really depends, but it does really depend on kind of your research questions and your approach. Um, but then those decisions that you're making on the transcription process really are more of an interpretative act, right? And your own assumptions and your own biases. And that decision does shape how the participant then is portrayed, right? Because you decide what information is relevant and valuable to include. So they mentioned that two transcribers might listen to the same audio and make different decisions on relevant data selection, how they would transcribe certain things. So then talking about the technology in the transcription, with all the advancements that we have, it really begs the question of we actually still need human transcription, because we have automated audio to text transcription. And we know that we're doing increased remote interviews, for example, over Zoom. We're recording it right now. If we were to generate a transcript, the quality of those transcripts have really improved over time. And they have improved to the point that they might generate kind of good enough for first drafts, right? Which can reduce costs and time. But those still need to be checked for accuracy, missing details, and then again, the context and the readability. Um, I think here again that the context is really important, right? Because a computer will not be able to understand, or maybe at least not yet, to understand what additional information to include so that the reader in a different context or in a different culture can understand a statement made by somebody in an interview. Then we also have the cloud-based artificial intelligence services, and those can raise ethical concerns and around data protection and confidentiality. Um, and again, some of those um, technology services or softwares, they are decisions that you need to make that just can't be made by a machine. For example, do you want to include filler words? Do you want to include hesitations? Do you want to include nonverbal cues? And also, those automated transcription services might be less accurate in group settings and being able to discern between multiple voices. I will say when it comes to the ethical concerns for software use or AI use, all of this, of course, has to be um, within the bounds of your IRB approvals, the regulations from certain groups. It may include even like data transfer agreements to outsource and to use softwares that are approved by your institution, all those kind of things. And now there's also softwares, for example, like in Vivo that allow for live coding of audio files. So what that looks like is you listen to the recordings, then you code for nonverbal cues, um, and then the note-taking and coding is based on predefined themes and matching with timestamps and nonverbal cues. And then you only transcribe some more specific quotes that will be of interest to you. So a lot of that we kind of talked about last time during the rapid qualitative analysis is one option. Um, what that does is it accounts for nonverbal communication group dynamics that usually is lost in full audio to text transcription because you start with that first round of being able to listen and to take notes on those nonverbal cues. All right, so in that paper, the this paper was specifically on sector research, which is research on the study of organizations that seek to improve society and who may be working with traditionally disenfranchised or disadvantaged groups. So the third sector is nonprofit and non-organizational, um, um, nonprofit and non-governmental organizations. So in that group, as you can imagine, a lot of the research published is using qualitative methods. And because they work with groups who may be transitionally disenfranchised or disadvantaged, there is the ethical obligation, of course, to ensure an accurate depiction of the participants and those organizations that they're interacting with. So that author looked at 133 recent qualitative publications in Voluntas, which is one of the big journals for nonprofit and NGO research. And in that, you'll see that 41%, so close to half, did not even discuss anything around uh, a transcription process. And then 19 said that interviews were transcribed, which I think is a sentence that we've all read in qualitative studies, but really keeping it in that passive voice, not giving any information about how. Um, Same here. Sorry, 19 say that they were transcribed only and don't talk about anything else. And then you have 11 that just say they are transcripts, but not how those were produced at all. And then those 26% that give further information, they say it's usually just saying who transcribed it and what type of transcription, but not necessarily defining what, for example, if you use intelligent verbatim, what that meant to them. Um, so then that really creates a problem of transparency in qualitative research. So the author then suggests a framework for undertaking and reporting transcription. So before transcribing, they really talk about the ethics and the data management and emphasizing, which is something that we really are or should be doing in all of our studies, but all those decisions should be made prior to the study begin, right? And of course, approved by regulatory bodies. And then during the interview, do you have a good recording device? Do you have a quiet environment? Are you setting yourself up to produce an interview or focus group that then has high enough audio quality to be transcribed potentially using software? So, and that the audio quality is good for you to listen to as well. Um, Quick reminder, if you are using your mobile phone, as long as it is approved by your IRB, make sure that it's on airplane mode so that you don't get a phone call in the middle of an interview and that automatically would stop the recording without you noticing. Um, and then you want to make that decision whether to transcribe or not to transcribe, right? It is considered standard practice to have transcripts of your qualitative or of your audio spoken words, but there are exceptions, right? You might have a situation where it's actually really inappropriate to record a conversation, or that it's just impossible to record, um, depending on the setting of the interview you're in, or if there's certain power dynamics or security concerns to have kind of that raw data recording. And then also your study design. So if you do ethnography and you're doing a lot more of longer term observation and more yeah, just spend more time in the communities, for example, you may not always be able to transcribe everything that you talk about. And then how to transcribe really again depends on the degree of detail that you want to include, right? So whether it's verbatim or intelligent verbatim. And again, your research question might beg for one or the other. And if you are using or choosing to do intelligent verbatim, some of the considerations is that you want to avoid any loss or distortion of meaning, right? By, for example, removing repetitions or correcting any of the grammatical errors, right? But you might say, I want to do intelligent verbatim, but I am still including nonverbal cues if they actually convey an important meaning. And that's again where that subjectivity comes in, right? And that reflexivity that you have to have as a researcher. And you also want to consider the text layout of your transcript document and whether you want to include timestamps, for example. So then who transcribes is another big question. The author really points out to avoid using the passive voice, right? Interviews were transcribed or a transcript was used because that really doesn't give you a whole lot of information, which is something that in scientific writing we always want to aim for an active voice, right, to give those type of additional information and context. So the researcher transcription, meaning the researcher who leads the study, who's involved in the study, and also conducted the interviews. If they transcribe, then it's generally assumed to be pretty coherent between the research approach and the transcription approach. And there's generally, you know, confidence that those transcripts are an accurate representation of the interview because that researcher was included throughout the process and is the one kind of generating the ideas and using the data. Now, if you're outsourcing that transcription, that could be either to a research assistant or a company. The author talk about to really provide detailed information to ensure an accurate representation, right? So you wanna make sure that the researcher also then checks the transcripts for accuracy afterwards. Um, and if you're outsourcing, so whoever transcribes, um, do they have enough content knowledge and familiarity with potential accents or dialects of your recording? Are they provided with key information about the project so they have an understanding of, what you're trying to do? And are they aware of important terms and acronyms? They also talk about maybe having a transcript example of one of the interviews, for example, completed by the researcher, and to provide a transcription protocol. Another option is to include the transcribers in the interviews so that, again, like they have that memory of being and that experience of being there in the room when that interview was conducted, and they are able to pick up a lot more in those nonverbal cues. And then they talk about the option of having memos of the transcription process and the contextual information, right? So memos and reflective memos is for whoever is doing the transcription or analysis or data collection to kind of reflect on those processes and those experiences, right? So that's where the transcriber could, for example, write down that the participants sounded tired or nervous or where the interview was set. If it's a public space like a coffee shop or something, maybe the participant actually is not very comfortable to fully speak freely. Did the interviewer interrupt the interviewee frequently, which is something that intelligent verbatim you might not necessarily see, but it could impact the flow of the interview. So then they talk about how to write about the transcription. That's where, we're kind of going back to those reporting guidelines that I mentioned earlier, the QORIC and the standard qualitative research. And so the minimum information that they suggest is to include who transcribed it, what measures were taken to ensure accuracy. So was there a protocol for transcribers? Was proofreading performed? Was there a spot checking or for potentially even do a participant checking where you return the transcripts to the participants to make sure that they feel like this is an appropriate representation of what they were trying to convey. And then also talking about the ethical considerations. The next part is the type of transcription. So are you doing a selective transcription where you transcribe only relevant quotes and themes? Are you using intelligent verbatim versus verbatim? And then any other subjective decision-making processes that you had to go through, right? So you really want to be transparent about that subjectivity and the positionality, meaning where do you fit in that whole process as the transcriber, right? So an example for that is information about how you made those decisions to select the transcription method. Is there a justification for it? And then also, how did you select your transcribers? So with that in mind, right, it's really about transcription, having it being part of the broader research process. And for that, it requires the same transparency and rigor, just like the data collection does, just like the data analysis does. So I'm going to end this one here with an example that this author mentioned as kind of like a good example of how to document transcription, right? So you'll see already just based on the space, this is a lot more than transcripts were generated, right? So they talk about that it was three Spanish-speaking investigators who transcribed all of the interviews from audio recording devices, checked each other's transcription for accuracy, and analyzed the interviews using thematic analysis. The transcribers also observed the focus groups and took notes on participants' voices and other identifying traits to help the transcription process go more smoothly. Researchers aided the transcribers in this regard by asking participants at the beginning of the focus groups to introduce themselves, using a pseudonym, and briefly remark upon how they prefer to spend their time. Right, so you see here already that it has a lot more information than what we so commonly see in manuscripts. I will say, and the author points that out too, in this example, they don't actually talk about what type of transcription, right? So whether it was verbatim, full verbatim, or intelligent verbatim. All right. So this is on the transcription process. Now we all work in international teams, right? We have people joining from Brazil, Tanzania, United States, and maybe some other places. So we're faced a lot with collecting qualitative data in a different language than the data that the publication will be in, for example, or the language that is different to kind of the common language used among all of the research team members. So then that begs the question, now that we have an understanding of how do we want to transcribe and potentially also think about having some of those considerations that now we can pay a little bit more attention to. Well, then once we have a transcript, what do we do about the translation? And for this one, I'm using this paper just to kind of guide us through. And you'll see that there's a lot of in the introduction and kind of the background and the rationale and the justification, you'll see a lot of overlap or a lot of the same arguments that we've seen in the transcription. So I'll go through those pretty quickly. But the first one is we have an increasing number of studies that where the source language, so the data you're collecting it in, is different to the target language, right? So the dissemination and publication language. And in qualitative research, going back to the transcription, right, qualitative research is to understand those contexts and societal realities and experiences. Language is a really big part of to kind of shape those social realities, right? And language in itself is more than just the words, right? And that makes translation in research potentially really challenging to capture that. So similar to what we've seen with the transcription, there's really little attention giving to the translation and kind of the implications of language differences, which really is at odds with the tradition of qualitative research, where we recognize how important it is to be reflexive and to have contextual understanding, right? But it also then creates a challenge for international researchers and cross-language studies, because you might shy away from wanting to do cross-language studies, for example. But then what happens with that is you're running the risk to marginalize non-English speaking participants, right? Because it may include higher costs for translations and an extra effort to maintain that methodological rigor of translation. So some people might choose to avoid doing those studies. And then you have also the risk of losing really those nuanced meanings, right? As I was saying, language is so much more than just the words. So um, there is a tendency then to maybe minimize the translation work because of that risk. So as I was saying, there is the lack of established guidance. We have the standards of for rigor through the core checklist, for example. But when it comes to translation, this really seems to be um, left up to the researcher and to the team to make those decisions. And that could introduce quality issues. So this author team talks about challenges surrounding why translate, when to translate, what to translate, who should translate, the process, so how would you do it, where it occurs, as in the actual physical location, and by what means. So what will it cost? And to answer that question, that author team reviewed each of those challenges and then reflected on kind of their own experiences. They also have done a literature review and then provided some recommendations to each of those challenges with the goal to really enhance the quality and the robustness of the translation practices. So when we go through what they found, they talk about the iceberg phenomenon. And what they're saying is that at the top, right, kind of what we always see is the papers of the explicit discussions of the dilemmas and challenging and translation, then providing suggestions and recommendations. Right? Those are the ones that we will go to find answers. But what they're saying that underneath the waterline, you have, in terms of numbers, a much more substantial body of work, the qualitative papers that do cross-cultural and cross-language studies, but they don't necessarily elaborate on their translation processes or the challenges identified, right? So there really is that continuum again of information that's provided. And you'll see here that on one side of the spectrum, you have that complete avoidance of translation, right? Um, Then you have the group that says we translate it, but it's not really acknowledged. Or that translation has happened, but it's not even necessarily mentioned. And then you kind of have that cursory acknowledgement where you have one or two sentences of a translation process. But you'll see that that's still like that whole area here where you have that explicit discussion, for example, of a translation is often left blank. So they um they kind of explain that in qualitative research often word counts and space is an issue, so that a lot of researchers then focus in the manuscripts on the outcomes rather than the processes, which makes sense to some extent, right? Because you want to be able to present your findings. But if you're cutting back on those decision-making processes, um, you're 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 unable to justify your decisions, right? And then that again um, can really impact your credibility and your rigor. So by openly discussing and reporting your translation decisions, you're helping to really kind of show again where you position yourself. You're making sure that you're acknowledging that there is a subjective and interpretative nature to it, and being transparent about that is really important. Okay, so let's go through those challenges. The first one is the why. So there is a strong recommendation in the literature to collect to collect data in the participants' native language to preserve the original meaning of words and minimizing the risk of misinterpretation. There is now, as you know, more and more an alternative to have a foreign language approach. So doing interviews in English or allowing the participants to choose the language for the interview. And that being said, right, the researcher and the participants, they both may feel more comfortable in their native language. So again, it's kind of that trade-off. And then You also translate because of the value to the international academic community. You want to be able to show your findings in the language that the academic community communicates in. Um, and a lot of times, translations also are required to enhance your academic career. If you require, for example, international publications for promotions, um, and then also to bridge the communication gap in international research teams, right? We see that here in our work a lot, and with a special focus on trainee supervisor research teams, right? So if I'm supervising a master student who's doing qualitative research for the very first time, and they're collecting data in a language that I don't speak, I probably would want to have everything translated into English so that I can actually provide feedback um, and be way more involved than if I had if I had a colleague who's also a qualitative researcher and who speaks that language and who could fill the role, right? So then when to translate, um, they really talk about the data way more than just the final interview transcript, for example, right? Um, you also maybe want to already translate before and during data collection, um, during data preparation, during analysis, and then the dissemination of results. And having those translations at each step of the process, again, is important if you have international research teams speaking different languages, so that you have that common language. And then there's the option of staying in the source language as long as possible, right? So staying until you analyze, or maybe even analyze in the source language, and then, like I said, only translate the other one. And they say that this tends to produce higher quality results because you're analyzing the data in their native language, right? So you're not losing anything in translation, literally. Um, and then they talk about translation of all data prior to analysis. And by not, only doing parts of it, for example, only selected quotes or only yeah, small portions of your data, that can increase the rigor of the research process. And then they talk about early versus late translation, where the early translation, meaning again, kind of like thinking about the process here, right? So the earlier you do that, it ensures that you have the homogeneity of the concepts and language, and it potentially also then saves translation costs. Um, but if you stay in the source language as long as you possibly can, it could potentially lead to higher quality results. Though I will say that a lot of that still really needs to be investigated, and there's more and more studies on kind of the research on the research methods, right, to find out what yields better results. And then what to translate, right? So in phenomenological studies, you really are trying to get an in-depth and precise, like an in-depth understanding of lived experiences, right? So here, language is used to express those experiences, and um, that interpretation is is really meaningful, right? But you could, for example, have an interpretation process during the interviews, right? Um, which could interrupt the natural flow of the interviews. And it might also, again, like with that interruption, the natural flow, participants might not be able to, or might not want to provide quite as much information. And then, for example, in ethnographic studies where you capture participant experiences over like a prolonged involvement and observation, you might not have fewer translation challenges, right? Because you don't have that short-term kind of in-depth and precise examination as you do in phenomenological studies. All right, so then who to translate? Again, it depends on who's in your research team, what resources have you available, and then what also are institutional regulations, right? Um, if you have a bilingual researcher, then and they are able to stay consistent throughout the whole study, and they have sociocultural competence and a background knowledge of the country and the study site, then that's really helpful, right? Um, versus professional translators who, at first sight, of course, will increase the credibility and the reliability of the collected data. Um, you want to make sure that again, the translation is accurate and also that the interpretation is accurate as they translate, right? So when you use professional translators, what is their personal background? What is their social context? And what's the worldview of the translator? And that's what they call the cultural brokerage, right? So saying you're not only translating kind of the words, but you're also building that bridge between those different cultures, right? So again, like thinking about the translation being a lot more than just changing words. So they're recommending to have what they call reflexive translators, so that the translators are briefed on the research objectives, that they have a thorough understanding, of course, of the grammatical and the discourse, linguistic, and strategic skills, but also that they're able to anticipate and be transparent about potential ethical dilemmas arising through the research processes. All right, we're almost there. So how to actually translate? There's different techniques that you could consider. One is to translate and back translate. You wanna think about how idioms and metaphors be translated. Um, they say you could do several iterative rounds of translation, so you get feedback and you revise. You can do the respondent validation or the member checking, where you return um, your translation to the participants, but of course, then that implies that they know that language too. To have a bilingual panel of experts to review the final version. And then also, one consideration is to do a blind back translation of the analyzed data. So, not the collected data, but only what you analyzed. And some of the challenges, as we already talked about, right? Idiomatic expressions, how do you translate those? They may be culturally specific concepts that have no equivalent in another language. There are differences in grammatical and syntactical structures. And sometimes there's also an absence or of a direct equivalent to an individual word, right? So thinking about how to provide sufficient cultural context to the audience, again, here is important so that they can follow. So when they talk about where to translate, they say, you can translate within the socio-geographical environment of the source language. You can translate within the environment of the target language, or you can translate outside of both, right? What they're saying here is with the location, you want to kind of integrate the social identities and can represent them, right? So, um, interestingly, though, no papers in the literature review that they've performed actually reported on the location. So then it makes it really difficult to kind of assess how effective and how relevant the translation was in relation to source and target language. So, yeah, I guess just something to kind of keep in mind, thinking about not only who, but also, again, that context. Are you closer to the source language? Or are you closer to the target language? And then by what means, right? So it is time consuming, it does take a lot of effort, and it could be costly. And we have supplementing tools for text translations. But then, for example, if you use those or AI, right, you have the efficiency of those technologies versus being able to maintain an accurate representation and also be culturally sensitive. So you want to consider the ability to provide the contextual knowledge, how to handle cultural sensitive terms, and then also providing subject matter expertise. So in conclusion, they talk about really, again, finding that balance, right? Which is in qualitative research, the case a lot of times. You want to have the highest methodological rigor, and it also needs to be feasible. Um, and you want to make sure that the research is relevant to the needs of your target group, right? Being really clear about that there is no neutral position from which to translate, right? Similar to the transcription, right? You are, as you're transcribing, you are changing the form of the data, whether it's from audio to text or from one language to the next, right? So being reflexive about that at all stages of the research project is important. They talk about, for example, like a researcher's diary to keep track of those decisions. And then also being really clear that that has a direct impact on the trustworthiness of the translated findings, and being transparent about those, right? And that they're saying that there's a need to shift the conversation of how we give voice to the participants across multiple languages in the most methodologically robust way as possible, because you want to, again, like thinking ethically, you really want to make sure that you are representing the voices of your participants in the data in the most comprehensive but also appropriate and representative way. All right, so with that, I will hand it over to Felipe to share maybe some of his thoughts on the processes of transcribing and translation, and then we can open up for questions. I'll open the chat in the meantime too.